If you're thinking about upgrading your power tubes to enhance your guitar tone, don't. While the idea of buying something new and shiny that glows when you turn it on sounds enticing, the simple truth is, despite what mountains of marketing tells you, changing the type of power tube in your guitar amp really doesn't make all that much of a difference. Last week, I released a video based on the viewer Nunakav 5307's assertion that he could tell the difference between 6L6 and EL34 power tubes using nothing more than his superhuman hearing. Unfortunately, he's left out a great deal of information, like what amp he was listening to when he heard these amazing changes. Was it the same amp, or was it two different amps using two different designs? The latter would probably seem much more likely, because tube amps aren't really designed to swap out power tubes. With a few notable exceptions, they will only work with the power tubes that they've been designed for, mainly because 6L6 and EL34 tubes have different pinouts, meaning the electrical connections have different functions. So unless you have an amp like a measuable rectifier, which is designed to accept both, chances are you're hearing two completely different amps, and that will have far more variables than just changing power tubes. But when we can isolate the one variable and change only the power tube, the argument tends to fall apart. But wow, guitar players sure will continue to argue anyway in some futile gesture to show the world just how right they truly are.
All right, Glenn, I hate to be that guy, but I think you should consider using a looper to eliminate less variables, especially if you're going to compare the sound waves visually on an EQ graph, instead of having the guitar player play the same part twice. Love your content and keep on rocking. Horns up from NC.
Hey Rusty, thanks for writing in, and I do appreciate you watching the show. However, you seem to have missed something critical here. Can I get a replay? Of course, the centerpiece for this test is the signal or reamp box. This allows us to send the exact same signal back to the amp and isolate a single variable. Now, I specifically explained that we're indeed using the same performance, but I can see how that would be very easy for you to miss, especially if your parents are cousins.
Hey, Ma! Get off the dang roof!
Now let's get to the reason why we're here. Let's look at the test and reveal what clip was using what tube. And to start us off, here's Justin Hoffman's observations.
If you don't have proper monitoring, you won't hear it. Didn't hear much of a difference on my 2-ways, but switching to my 3-ways, 100% can tell a difference, especially on the cleans. First was more pronounced high mid, where the second was smoother and the low mid sounded warmer. This could be from the circuit, as another had mentioned, depending on how tubes are powered, and the internals 100% changes how they sound/react.
Hey, interesting point. Let's have a listen. All right, so let's take a quick look here. What we've got here are the 6L6 in red and the EL34 in green. Now, interestingly enough, what we see here in the bottom end is a very, very slight difference of about a decibel there at 242 hertz, with the EL34 having a little bit more bottom end. And the wild thing is, if we look here at the top end, we see like the biggest variance here. It looks like the 6L6 is slightly brighter with 111 dBs versus 110, about 1.3 dBs difference at 3.5 kilohertz, somewhere right around there. Pretty interesting stuff, but it doesn't seem to be like you'd see on a speaker with these wild variances of like 10, 12, and even 14 decibels all up and down the spectrum. The only time, one seems to kind of make any kind of difference here is just for a very brief peak here at about 2.3 kilohertz, where the EL34 gets to be a bit louder. But it would seem that the 6L6 is slightly brighter than the EL34 and then has a little less bottom end. Isn't that the exact opposite of what you said it was, Justin? Look on the bright side. If there's ever a zombie apocalypse, you'll be perfectly safe, because zombies eat brains. Now, next up, we've got Andrew Becker chiming in.
It's pretty obvious that the In the Mix clips were purposely recorded with way too much saturation in an attempt to make them sound as much alike as possible. Glenn acts like he doesn't understand why people keep requesting Enter Breakup samples for the tone comparisons if he clings to the absurd overgeneralization with all the videos. What's the point? Just playing stupid to pretend he doesn't get it? Whatever strokes your ego, man. You know damn well pickups, tubes, amps have different character that is without a doubt measurable. Blasting everything so loud will obviously make it all sound like shit. What does that prove? Dial them back to the sweet spot like any normal player would and stop pretending.
Wow, Andrew, nothing gets by you, man, especially the edge of breakup test we did. Now here's the measurements I did on edge of breakup, and this is even less of a difference than the cleans here. I mean, this is all very much falling completely across the board here. Maybe way up around 14 kilohertz, we see a little bit of a variation, but it's not a whole lot, with the 6L6 being in blue and the EL34 being in, I think that's orange. Pardon me, guys, I'm partially colorblind. But we can't really say one dominates the other, not by any kind of significant amount. I mean, like, we're talking maybe half a decibel at best on edge of breakup. Absolutely fascinating stuff. Andrew, you are absolutely correct. The differences are without a doubt measurable, even on edge of breakup. However, those differences are much like your intelligence, almost non-existent. Now, not to be outdone, here's some wisdom from Dave Viner.
You're never going to hear the difference in tubes when you're using them in a dual rectifier. Everyone knows that.
And that's because it's one of the very few amps that will allow you to swap out power tube types. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, because on high gain here, this is where we see the biggest differences. This is the place everybody said they couldn't tell the difference. But when we zoom in here, we can see what's going on, in the mid range here, and in the low mids, we're seeing a difference of about, 97 to 95, maybe 2 decibels here, with the EL34 being green and the 6L6 being blue. But when we get to the top end here, this is where it gets real interesting here. It seems once again that the 6L6 is a bit brighter here, and we're seeing an even bigger jump. Where are we at? About 5.2 kilohertz. We're at 101 dBs to 97. So that's about a 4 dB difference. Very interesting stuff. And then when we get into the extreme top end here, this is where we start seeing the biggest jumps. Look at this. This is crazy. We go from 82 decibels on the 6L6 all the way down to 69 on the EL34. So the wild thing here is that in this test, anyway, on this particular amp, the 6L6s have more energy, not only in the bottom end, but in the extreme top end as well. Whereas in the mid-range, they're fairly evenly matched. There's a few variances up and down the spectrum, so we will get a slightly different mid, but it's not anything massive. Now, this is really interesting to me because I thought these would be a dead-on match up and down the spectrum, but because I've improved my testing method, I can make measurements and I can see exactly what's going on. And yes, they do indeed sound different. Very cool stuff indeed. Hey Dave, I'm really curious, exactly what amp should I be using for this test? It's amazing how everyone can jump on the amp being used, but nobody can offer a better alternative to illustrate their point. If you have a suggestion, I am listening, but it has to be a single amp with swappable tube types. And rounding out this test, here's Hanzo90 with yet another brilliant observation.
Dumb test for the viewers, given that we are hearing it through our speakers and not in the room. Massive difference.
Hey Hanzo, have you ever tried miking up your guitar and wondered why it doesn't sound like it does in the room? Yeah, that is the point of this channel, to help you make better recordings. I even put the word studios in the channel title. But apparently that wasn't obvious enough for those of you out there who are as sharp as a bag full of marbles. Now, for those of you guys who are using amp sims, here's a very interesting point.
Couldn't hear a difference at all. It's strange that an amp sim with swappable tube emulations will have such a difference between them, but real life seems to disprove that. Generally in amp sims, I find EL34s to be more mid-forward and therefore louder, but I wonder whether that change has been programmed in deliberately.
Hey Blackett, keep in mind, amp sims are not real amps. Some programmers will sweeten what their virtual power tubes do so the users don't get pissed off when they swap them and nothing happens. Now, the one thing that I've noticed in this specific test anyway is that the EL34s I used here were 2 dBs louder across the entire spectrum than the 6L6s. This would play into the equal loudness contour, where we perceive louder as better. But when you gain match, suddenly those differences aren't nearly as much as we thought they were. And that is why it's so important to get the levels the same. Otherwise, it's very easy to make the wrong judgment and burn up your money on something you might not need. I always love it when I do a test and the results weren't what I expected. Turns out the biggest changes were in the clips where nobody could actually hear a difference. Going through the comments, it's the same thing over and over again. Most claimed they could hear a difference on the cleans but couldn't hear anything on the heavies. And yet the distorted clips had the biggest measurable variances. In this case, the EL34 seemed to have more going on in the top end, yet despite everybody listening to it, nobody could pick it out of the full mix. Interesting stuff indeed. So my observation in all of this, if your power tubes are working, they're probably the right ones for your amp. Don't waste your money on something you probably won't need. And if you're looking to improve your guitar tone, especially in a recording situation, upgrade your speakers first because that will make massive improvements to your tone. I'll see you guys next time, and remember, do the world a favor and have your guitars spayed or neutered today.